You possibly could have won a bet with me had you told me that Pitt has defeated Virginia Tech 5 of the last 6 meetings. It's the ACC opener for both Pitt at 2-1, taking on Virginia Tech at 2-2. But, of course, those 2 losses are just exhibition games. We bring in Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC to kind of clarify that statement. So, Mike, we'll bring it in right there. Post East Carolina loss, losing to the Pirates for the 2nd consecutive year, Frank Beamer hit the podium.
Yeah, and right before that, here's a fun stat also. Virginia Tech's last real Power 5 opponent that they've beaten at home was Pittsburgh back in 2013. I mean, yes, they beat UVA at home last year, but they've struggled at home against real ACC opponents, which makes me question even more why Frank Beamer would come up to the podium after 6-win seasons, just repeatedly over the last couple seasons, come up to the podium after playing against an East Carolina team that they were 8.5-point favorites. They were up 14-0 in the first quarter. They blow it. They play horrible defense throughout the entirety of the second half. Yes, Kendall Fuller's hurt. We get it. But they need to tackle, right? So they play horrible in the second half of that game. Frank Beamer steps up to the podium and says, well, you know what? We treat the non-conference games as exhibition games. What? How can you say that? Would you hear Urban Meyer? This is a question for you, Mark. Would you hear Urban Meyer or Nick Saban going up to the podium after a loss and saying, you know what? It was a non-conference game. You know, we had tough go of it, but we have our SEC schedule, and those non-conference games are exhibition games anyway.
I don't think if you're coaching FBS football, period, let alone Power 5 football, but I could expect maybe a Kansas coach to say that at this point in the program's development. But this is a guy that has lifted this program to a top 25 status consistently, top 10 status throughout the 90s and early 2000s, and he's fallen on hard times, and I don't know if he's making excuses or just this is the state of Virginia Tech football, so get used to it. This is what it is.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I don't understand how you can come out and say, yeah, you know what, we're only playing for the ACC. I mean, that's essentially what you're saying, standing up at the podium making a comment like that. This is a team that hasn't even been to the conference championship since 2011. They got their doors blown off by a Clemson team that they lost to earlier in the season. And I was a freshman at Virginia Tech that year. I'll tell you what, Mark, I paid $140 to get into the Clemson game at home and then go to the ACC championship. And I saw them get absolutely destroyed in both of those games. So for Frank Beamer, I'm talking more as a passionate fan than a writer. For Frank Beamer to come out and say, you know what, we're only playing for the ACC. I mean, if that doesn't signal that you may need a change, especially with the way Virginia Tech's struggling, I don't know what does. And not only have they not been to a conference championship game since 2011, they haven't won the ACC championship since 2010, Tyrod Taylor's senior year. So, I mean, make of those comments what you will. People who have been around Frank Beamer for a really long time and have listened to any of his press conferences or have listened to him do local radio down in Blacksburg aren't extremely surprised with the comments he makes. Sometimes, he just, wind him up and let him go, and he doesn't even know what direction he's going. But it's kind of unacceptable to say that, especially after a loss that was as bad as that one on the road at East Carolina last weekend.
Mike, when you told me that, I was trying to fathom a situation in which a major college football coach that coaches, again, a team that has been a top 10, top 25 program for the past 20 years would be in a position to make that statement. Then I thought, week 1, they played Ohio State, big underdog. Maybe he says it there. But then if you have that mindset even for that game, you don't schedule Ohio State then. And then you've got East Carolina. No team in the ACC should be losing to East Carolina on a regular basis. Nobody, especially of Virginia Tech status. And East Carolina is coming off a 24-point loss to Navy. So it's bad.
Yeah, it's bad. Navy has their way with that East Carolina defense, and Brendan Motley played well for Virginia Tech in this game against East Carolina, but offensively, there's just not really a sense of urgency when they're in the two-man offense. They have this no huddle that they want to run down 2 touchdowns with 11 minutes to go, but they can't get the plays in the Motley. They're doing all their hand signals, doing how they usually call the plays in, and I don't want to hear the excuse that, well, Motley's a backup quarterback, Brewer's been out. Look, it's the 4th game of the season. You've been rolling with Motley at quarterback for what was the 3rd straight week. You have to have a handle on the 2-minute offense if you're playing quarterback, and I think Motley did, but Loeffler not getting the plays in, Scott Loeffler, the offensive coordinator, not getting the plays in and them running the play clock down inside 10 seconds, sometimes inside 5 seconds, why are you running no huddle at all? There needs to be more of a sense of urgency on offense with 11 minutes to go. And, with these Frank Beamer comments, it's just giving off the impression that they're kind of playing down to opponents, especially the ones they think they can beat. Tech beat down Furman, they beat down Purdue, and they lost a tough game to Ohio State, who was a much better team. But when you have a bad game against a team that you should handle, I think you're sending the wrong message to the media, to the fans, when you're saying, you know what, it's an exhibition game anyway. It's not an ACC play. I mean, that's not what the fans want to hear. And if that's the message you're sending to the players, how can you expect them to take their opponent seriously if, they come out in an off week? So that's just my 2 cents on that. I just think it wasn't the right thing to say. And it may be something that comes back to haunt Frank Beamer, especially if this team only wins 6 or 7 games once again this season.
So you broke down to us the inefficiency of the offense and trying to clock manage down 2 scores late in the game, down like 35-21, trying to make a comeback. The other thing that jumps out to me is just giving up the 35 points against East Carolina when you got the likes of Daddy Nicholas and Luther Maddie, Ken Eckenham up front, Corey Marshall, these guys that are just studs up front, and giving up those kind of points.
Yeah, and Tech right now, they're a team that was supposed to have a defense that was ranked in the top 10, top 15 in the country, and right now they're barely inside the top 70. They're just a team that's really struggling to stop the run right now, something that was extremely unforeseen, and they're trotting Greg Stroman out there at cornerback for whatever reason. He's a sophomore. He's an exciting player. He's athletic. Wasn't exactly highly thought of coming out of high school, but we saw in the punt return game last year, especially when he got running in the right direction, that he could be dynamic. But, playing him in the secondary, I don't think is the wisest move. And there was actually some discord there between Bud Foster and defensive back coach Torian Gray as to who was going to start in place of Kendall Fuller before the East Carolina game. I guess they had been running Terrell Edmonds, the brother of running back Trey Edmonds. He plays cornerback. They were running him out there in practice all week. Then before the game, Torian Gray came out and said to Bud Foster, hey, we're going to roll with Stroman. Well, they went with Stroman in the secondary in East Carolina. East Carolina quarterback Blake Kemp throws 2 quick touchdowns in the first quarter there, in the second quarter to tie the game back up. And all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, maybe Greg Stroman shouldn't have been out there to begin with. It's a mess on defense right now. The strength of the team is all of a sudden the Achilles heel. Tech's got a pretty efficient offense. They're top 25 in offensive efficiency right now, which is the complete opposite of what you expected, especially with the injuries they had up front. I mean, if you told me at the beginning of the year that, they were going to have a top 30 offense, top 30 ranked offense in efficiency, and, with the defense they had, I would have told you that they would have been in pretty good shape, but the defense hasn't played well. The offense has been shoddy at times, and there's always been a question with the play calling with Scott Loeffler. So I think Tech's really just shooting themselves in the foot at this point. They have too much talent to drop a game like that to East Carolina.
Chad Wojtek was a kid at Pitt who had a decent season last year. They gave him more the keys to the car late in the season with Tyler Boyd at wide receiver, but they weren't satisfied with his play through a couple games against Akron and Youngstown State. They turned it over to Nate Peterman, who is more of a pocket passer. He's delivered well. He has thrown the ball on time and been very accurate in the Pitt offense. They lost James Conner, who was just Mr. Everything, 26 touchdowns, ACC Offensive Player of the Year, MVP last season. So they've gone with a couple of freshmen in the backfield, true freshmen, running the ball rather well for Pitt. The one loss is a pretty respectable one at this point. They went to Iowa. They lost 27-24 on a 57-yard field goal at the gun. That's the one loss for Pitt, now at 2-1. So that's pretty much the situation for Pitt's offense, Mike.
Yeah, and with the amount they've used Nate Peterman, you have to wonder if they might go with a change of pace with Chad Wojtek, who ran all over the Hokies last season in that home game for Pittsburgh, which ended up being a win there on a Thursday night. But especially with the amount of problems Tech's had stopping opposing quarterbacks when they've been able to run the ball, we might see a little bit more of Chad Wojtek this weekend, but we'll just have to see. But like you said, they got a lot of playmakers there on offense. Tyler Boyd, obviously the highlight name there at receiver. I expect Brandon Faison to to play a lot in coverage on Tyler Boyd this week. But, Boyd is one of the most dynamic receivers in the ACC. He's a big target, and he goes out and he makes a lot of plays, both in the passing game and in the return game. So he's a guy that can only be held down for so long. I expect him to play well for Pittsburgh. And no James Conner, no problem. Quadri Allison has been fantastic at running back for Pittsburgh, 305 yards rushing this season through 3 games and a couple of touchdowns. So you've got your replacement for James Conner. Allison's played well. If Peterman at quarterback doesn't turn the football over, I expect to see more of him than Voidick. But, if Peterman does a good job of holding onto the football and making smart decisions, I don't see why Pitt couldn't go into Blacksburg, especially in the weather that they're supposed to have there, and have a good chance to win.
Yeah, Pitt on defense has also played well. Again, we mentioned Akron and Youngstown, the 2 opponents. Iowa's not going to scare anyone offensively, but they're pretty proficient with C.J. Beathard. They've got a strong running game, and Pitt is now currently holding the opposition to less than 300 yards total offense per game, has yielded just the 1 touchdown pass. They've got a couple underclassmen that are making plays on that defense, and Avonte Maddox and Jordan Whitehead for the Pitt Panthers. So this is key in regards to maybe establishing one of these teams as a dark horse to challenge the likes of possibly Georgia Tech or Miami or North Carolina if the Heels prevail against the Jackets in Atlanta in this coastal race, Mike. So who do you like with Virginia Tech hosting Pitt?
Well, Pitt's got the number 17th ranked defense in the country right now. They're going into Blacksburg, with an extra week to prepare, coming off of a tough loss to Iowa by a field goal. They played pretty well in that game on the road. Pitt could easily be 3-0, but Iowa was a nice tune-up game, so to speak, because it was an opponent that had a lot of merit. It's a pretty good Big Ten team. And like you said, they're not going to scare anybody, but they're a quality opponent, and Pitt got a good tune-up non-conference game against a real opponent before entering ACC play. And you know what? I think with the weather the way it's supposed to be in Blacksburg, I think it's going to be fit more towards running the football. Quadri Allison has been very good for Pittsburgh, but if they roll with Nate Peterman at quarterback for a majority of the game, I see Tech being able to maybe game plan a little bit more for Allison and maybe shut him down, because I think Tech's defense this week is going to be looking to make a statement after how poorly they tackled against East Carolina. The game being in Blacksburg, being back in the friendly confines, even though they have struggled at home of late, I think that having a game at home after a tough loss is kind of what the doctor ordered for Tech. Their defense is going to bounce back. They're going to be a resilient bunch despite losing Kendall Fuller for the season earlier this week. That's a huge blow for the future prospects for the Hokies, but they're at home. I think it's going to be an ugly game. I don't think there's any question about that. With the weather the way it's supposed to be, the quarterback play for both teams, Brendan Motley has played well for Tech, but he's playing a real defense this week, a team in Pittsburgh that can make you pay if you drop back and make a mistake. So I'm going to take the Hokies. I'm going to actually be in Blacksburg, hopefully, if the weather holds up. It's kind of up in the air at this point. I might be going down there for the game. I'd like to see Tech win, just being an alum. It's going to be tough, just tough conditions. It's kind of who establishes the run, who stops the run. I think that's the biggest question to be answered in this one. I think whatever team does a better job running the football will win the football game. And I think Pittsburgh being a little bit more one-dimensional with Nate Peterman at quarterback will hurt them. And Brendan Motley has the ability for Tech to make some plays with his legs. And the Tech offense has been pretty solid over the last few weeks. So I like the Hokies in a close one at home.
Man, I am going back and forth on this one. I probably changed my mind about 4 times during the time that I heard you make your pick, because I like Virginia Tech having one of the better players in the conference at corner and Brandon Faison, even though Fuller's gone. The front line defensively for Virginia Tech has underachieved, but it's still just stacked. They're at home. Moxley does bring that component of a dual threat for Virginia Tech. Pitt's a little bit more settled at quarterback. Peterman's playing well. Again, he can't break containment and hurt a defense, though. Wow, this is a tough one to call. I'm going to go with Virginia Tech at home. They win it by a field goal, let's say 23-20. So we'll go with that. All right, Mike McDaniel joining us from inside the ACC. Thanks a lot, Mike.
All right, thanks, Mark.